There is no Wii U game over the past decade that I have played more than Star Fox Zero. It is the game that I have stuck with over the past decade. It's the game I've come back to the most. There is no other game that has made me get the Wii U out, charge the gamepad, and play another round of arcade mode. Star Fox Zero is by far one of the best games on the console, if not the best. And considering its status as a true Wii U exclusive, a title that has never been re-released, a title that is not available on any other platform, a title that cannot be pirated or emulated on any other hardware, this is a stellar example of just how Nintendo puts out bangers that are easily overlooked by the community at large. Every time I come back to this game, I find myself very, very taken aback by how good it is. This is a game that I have been playing consistently for 10 years, and yet I constantly find new strats. I constantly improve my skills. I constantly find more reasons to come back to it. On my most recent playthrough, I've recently discovered just how engaging and intuitive the arcade mode actually is. I have played the arcade mode more in the past few days than I have in the game's entire lifespan so far. Previously, when I would play this game, I would go through the main mode, I would unlock the levels, I would do the medals, and by the time that I unlocked hard mode, I felt like I was pretty much done with the game. I didn't really see the point in arcade mode. But having come back to it recently and not just playing it and then putting it down for a bit and picking up again, but like playing it over and over and over again, you really start to understand how arcade mode in particular is endlessly replayable because it does have the multiple paths. It does have the challenge. It does have the high stakes because this game is brutally difficult to begin with, but in arcade mode, two deaths and you're done. Okay. You can get an extra continue, like if you get all three gold rings, but generally speaking, you have one life throughout the entire 2.5 hour run. Okay. It's very interesting, like figuring this out, realizing this, because one of the major criticisms towards Star Fox Zero initially was this idea that it was too short, this idea that it was over too quickly and that there was nothing to do after beating the game. That was very obviously not true to begin with. In the main mode alone, you have like all the unlockable stages, you have all the paths, you have all the medals, which take a good chunk of time to do. I would say 25 hours. And then you unlock arcade mode, which I traditionally did not play much of because I felt like I was done with the game and it was just playing through the same levels I had already played to death. But like upon coming back to arcade mode and playing them over and over and over again, you really get this sense of just how much arcade mode changes the core experience. Main mode was essentially easy mode. And if you think back to how game journals played this game and how they couldn't figure out the relatively simple control scheme, you can kind of understand what the problem with this is that Star Fox Zero is a game that's simply too challenging for the mass audiences. This is something that was way too difficult, something that like took way too much of a time investment, and a lot of people wrote it off before even really trying it. But if you do get to the point where you play these stages over and over and over again and realize just how technically demanding they are, what you get is one of the most rewarding, intense single player experiences ever. It is wild the kind of stuff you can pull with this game, considering the control scheme, considering the level layouts, considering the unique mechanics. Like, it is crazy. See, like playing arcade mode and seeing just how many wild deviations you can get. Getting the R wing on Zonus, getting like that crazy uh like 9 person like dogfight. Like seeing like all the weird variations that you just don't really see in main mode. Arcade mode in a way is the mode where the game truly shines. But the issue with this is that like you have to put such a time investment in. You have to put so much effort in to learn the mechanics, learn the skill set, learn how the game works, and really pay attention to what's happening because I feel like a lot of people are in this mindset where it's like this is an uncharted experience and you just beat the game and put it down and never pick it up again. No, like this is meant to be an endlessly replayable experience. And there's a lot of incentive to come back and play these levels over and over again. In the main mode, you have like, the alternate paths and the medal system, but in arcade mode, simply getting to the end is actually quite an ordeal. Like the simple fact of the matter is this game is not easy. Like even if you're like good and have been playing for years, I've been very surprised at how much I've struggled with certain things. Dying against certain bosses, failing on certain objectives, even ones that I've cleared before. Like the game really is quite punishing. And what's interesting about it is just how little the general public seems to know about the difficulty. Because what's traditionally happened with this game is that people say it's broken and it's unplayable because of the control schemes, and they just kind of leave it at that. Like, oh yeah, if you play through all of it, it'll take 2.5 hours, bro. And like they don't really talk about the replay value. They don't really talk about the fact that this game is endlessly replayable. They don't really talk about how complex the dogfighting is or the boss fights. Like again, it really does feel like the vast majority of gaming YouTubers played this game once, put it down, and never picked it up again. And that's kind of how I think this game has had such a weird reputation over the years, because actual fans like myself have been playing it day one and have had a blast with it. But every other casual YouTuber on the planet, whether it's like some Comedy Johnny or Scott the Waz or like any of these people, like they are legit sleeping on one of the best action games of the past 10 years. This is way better than Doom 2016. It's way better than like anything else that's come out since. Like the game was like such a huge cut above most action games that it filtered the vast majority of the audience. Like the simple fact of the matter is, uh, most Star Fox fans are not really Star Fox fans. They're not people who have like played 64 over and over again. They kind of beat Andros, maybe on the true path, and kind of consider the game to be over. They don't really think about like the value of the score attack. They don't really think about medals. They don't really think about like achievements. They don't really think about improving their skill set. Like they beat it, and in their minds, that means that like they know everything there is to know about the game. And the simple fact of the matter is that's not true. Like as you play Star Fox Zero, you start to develop like all these crazy skill sets and all these like techniques that are very much unique to this game. For example, the targeting system. The way the game works is that you can fly and shoot in two different directions. And like the narrative has always been that this doesn't add anything and that other games like Sin and Punishment, Star Successor do it way better. But the reality is Star Fox really gives you that feeling that you're flying around in a plane, flying circles around your enemy and like trying to get them with your targeting computer, right? You see this in like boss fights where they'll like spin around really fast, like firing lasers at you, and you end up diving out of the way by using the unique camera angles, right? Like there's really nothing quite like it. When you fight something like say Aqua Rosa, and you're just kind of like you know, diving down, shooting the weak spots, and then like darting back up when the lightning bolts, when the lightning blast comes, like that's something that really wouldn't be possible in other games. So like when you're dogfighting with Starwolf, like that's not something that would be possible in other games. The problem with Star Fox Zero is a problem with the audience, not with the actual game itself. Because what typically happens with games is that they don't offer enough for the player, they don't engage enough with the player, they don't demand enough of the player. Star Fox Zero, in a way, is kind of the exact opposite, where it kind of demands too much. For anybody of like a below average or even above average skill level, right? The game can be really, really overbearing because of how difficult and challenging it is. This is something that's way more technically demanding than something like Elden Ring or Doom 2016 or Cyberpunk 2077. And instead of acknowledging like the issue is a skill level one, in regards to the player, like the community at large just wrote the game off as being broken and unfinished. And the reality is, this is one of the most seamless, intense action games you'll ever play in your life. As you get better and better at it, like you'll be like blowing through these levels like crazy and like discovering new tricks and like improving your skill set and pulling off like really incredible stunts. Right. You'll know everything there is to know about the game. You'll know how to take advantage of it, and you'll constantly be like tweaking your moves and all that. The problem is that like the players didn't do that. The problem is players gave up instantly once they were asked to do anything more challenging than simply clearing a level. And the game is the game is an example, I think, of how being this hardcore and being this challenging will turn away a vast portion of your audience because I think what most people wanted was something that was casual, something that was laid back, something that was generic and boring, like Halo. You know, they wanted Star Fox Assault 2, and instead they got one of the best action games of all time, and they simply couldn't handle it. In general, I feel like Star Fox Zero is representative of the Wii U era in general because we were getting all these crazy games. You know, games like New Super Mario Bros. U, games like Nintendo Land, games like Super Mario 3D World, games like Pikmin 3, The Wonderful 101, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, games Splatoon, games like Tokyo Mirage Sessions, games like Kirby and the Rainbow Curse, Yoshi's Woolly World, Xenoblade Chronicles X, Devil's Third. Okay, we were getting all these amazing games from all these different developers, and the entire industry turned its nose up at it because the simple fact of the matter is these were not generic games made for the masses. These were not Witcher 3s, these were not Grand Theft Auto 5s, these were actual video games. And Star Fox Zero, I think, kind of represents the apex of that mindset, in which you have a game that's way better looking, that's more technically demanding, that has way more content, that has way more going on. And yet the masses just don't understand that because, like, well, like the it doesn't have a story. Like, it's just a remake of Star Fox 64. They tried so hard to like downplay this game that it got to the point where they were straight up making things up about it. You know, like there have been so many things I've heard said about this game over the years, but what really gets me is just how it feels as if the game's harshest critics never really gave it a chance. Because we were hearing a lot of these people say that the controls were broken and unusable before the game even came out. You know, we were hearing people bitching about Crystal not being in it. You know, we were hearing people like making all these wild accusations about the game. Remember when it was supposed to be delayed for a while to like so they could fix the control schemes, and then it turned out not to be the case. You know, like we were hearing things like that, you know, from the community, and I I just didn't respect it. Like even when this game was coming out, like I strongly suspected that this was none of this was true and that the game would be a masterpiece, and it has exceeded all of my expectations over the past decade. With Star Fox being in the Fox McCloud, that is, with Fox McCloud being in the Super Mario Galaxy movie, I have to wonder if this is going to be a major turning point for Star Fox Zero. Like, I wonder if this is going to be the point where people look at this game and they start to tell themselves that, like, you know, that was actually a really good game. It might be, you know, like kind of like how Majora's Mask was handled, or games like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, where the game like slowly appreciates with time and becomes one of the all-time best. Like, and I do think it deserves it. Uh, but like, it's definitely something that we need to talk about more. Is just how this game was so disrespected and so ignored over the past decade. Like, at the very least, this should have been celebrated as an attempt at bringing Star Fox back. Like, even if it wasn't as good as 64, at the very least, it moved away from the stupid gimmicky stuff and it brought it back to rail shooting. It brought it back to pure action. You know, you're flying the plane, you're fighting these crazy bosses. Like, it should have been celebrated for that reason alone, but it wasn't. Like, what ended up happening is that people like started thrusting all of their personal nonsense onto this game. You know, whether it was complaining about the Wii U or the control scheme or the brand or like not having a story, not being like Star Fox Assault. You know, you saw a lot of people just kind of coming out and nonsensically complaining about this game. And it wasn't rooted in the game's actual quality because most of these people never played it. This was just a vehicle to complain about Nintendo, to complain about the Wii U, to complain about Star Fox, to just kind of be the apex of just Nintendo hate. And 10 years later, it feels like the culture around Nintendo is starting to change. You know, the people who grew up with the 90s and some people who grew up with Sonic the Hedgehog and PlayStation, they're adults now. And all of a sudden just endlessly complaining about Nintendo games doesn't really seem all that appealing. Like there are a handful of hardliners who will stick by like their Nintendo hate grift forever, professional YouTubers maybe, and maybe game journos. But I think by and large, actual fans, like when they go back and experience this, like they're gonna find that it's actually quite a bit better than they've been led to believe. The game is perfectly playable and it's perfectly enjoyable. And I think as you spend more and more time with it, you'll find that it's actually very, 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 very good. It's interesting, but I haven't really been that fired up about a new Star Fox game over the past decade because I have been playing this. I've always loved Zero. I've always been an advocate for Zero. I've always been playing Zero. Like, I don't really need a new Star Fox, is kind of my mentality. Like, Zero is the game I always wanted from the franchise, a proper follow up to 64. Nintendo could make a sequel. They could make a direct sequel to Zero. They could make it a new thing. They could reinvent the franchise. And I imagine they will. But at the same time, I'm very glad and very thankful that this got produced and that Nintendo put out something like as high quality as this. This is one of my all-time favorites. Definitely one of those games that has stood the test of time and will continue to be played and enjoyed for years to come. And I can only hope that someday, when this game is properly re-released, this game gets a proper reevaluation and is considered to be a high point of the franchise. This is better than Command. This is way better than Assault. Adventures isn't really a Star Fox game. Star Fox 2 never came out, and the original Super Nintendo game hasn't aged all that well. Okay. The only real competition this game has for best in the franchise is the all time classic Star Fox 64. And considering that game is considered one of the best ever made, this one really should be considered a highlight of the franchise.